Sir Harrington's flush deepened to an alarming shade of purple, and for a moment Peter wondered whether he ought to position himself nearer to the man in case a collapse became imminent. Instead, Harrington sank into a nearby wing-back chair with the grace of a sack of grain, gesturing weakly toward a decanter of brandy that sat on the sideboard, like a silent reproach. "You're quite right," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I did contact the newspaper, this morning directly after the discovery, but not for the reasons you might think, Lord Peter. I assure you I am not some vulgar attention seeker. There is a method to what must seem like madness." Peter poured brandy for them both, a liberty he rarely took in another man's house, but one that seemed warranted by circumstances, and settled himself into a chair with deliberate casualness. "Do elaborate. Methods fascinate me almost as much as madness does, and the conjunction of the two is quite irresistible. The medallion," Harrington began, "is not merely a historical artifact. It is evidence, or rather it may become evidence in a matter that is far more delicate than a simple theft. You see, Lord Peter, I purchased it from a dealer in Brussels 3 months ago. At the time, I believed it to be nothing more than what the museum's catalogue describes, a 15th-century Flemish piece, probably used in some minor diplomatic ceremony. The provenance seemed sound enough, though the dealer was somewhat evasive about its recent history. Evasive dealers are as common as fleas on a street dog, Peter observed, and considerably less interesting. What changed your assessment? 6 weeks ago, I received a visit from a man calling himself Dr. Nathaniel Creed. He claimed to be an antiquarian scholar interested in Flemish metalwork. He was courteous, educated, and seemed quite genuinely interested in my collection. We spoke for perhaps an hour. He left his card and expressed a desire to examine the medallion more closely at some future date. Harrington paused to drink deeply from his brandy. 3 days later, I received a letter from him. It was quite extraordinary, Lord Peter. He claimed that the medallion bore certain inscriptions, minute markings that only someone with specific knowledge would recognize, that suggested it had belonged to a particular historical family. A family whose affairs, he said, involved matters of considerable political sensitivity. Peter felt that delightful tingle of anticipation that preceded most interesting puzzles. "And did you examine the medallion for these mysterious inscriptions?" "I did, with considerable difficulty. The markings are so fine that they are nearly invisible to the naked eye. I required a magnifying glass of significant power. But yes, they are there, a series of tiny symbols, deliberately concealed within the decorative border." Dr. Creed's letter suggested that if I could decipher them, or rather, if the proper authorities could decipher them, they would reveal information regarding a document, a manuscript, I believe, that disappeared nearly a century ago under rather contentious circumstances. "How delightfully obscure," Peter murmured. "And this Dr. Creed, did he provide any explanation as to why he was sharing this information with you, a complete stranger?" "He did not. He merely suggested that I contact him should I wish to discuss the matter further. But Lord Peter, here is where the situation becomes genuinely troubling. 3 weeks after his initial visit, Dr. Creed was found dead. An apparent suicide in his rooms in London. The coroner's verdict was that he had taken an overdose of laudanum. The autumn light through the windows seemed to grow colder, though Peter knew this to be mere psychological suggestion. And you naturally drew the conclusion that his death was connected to this medallion and whatever historical secrets it contained, would you not?" Harrington demanded, some of his earlier distress returning. "A man comes to you with cryptic information about a mysterious artifact, then dies shortly afterward. It seemed obvious that I possessed something dangerous, something that someone else very much wished to recover. Hence your decision to deposit it in the museum," Peter said, understanding beginning to dawn. "By making it public, by having it catalogued and displayed, you calculated that it would be far less valuable to anyone wishing to suppress it. A stolen artifact in a private collection is leverage. A stolen artifact from a museum is merely a theft." "Precisely," Harrington confirmed, relief flooding his features. "I believed that by announcing its presence through official channels, by having it examined by the museum's curator, I would render it harmless. And I thought that perhaps, if someone were desperate enough to steal it from a public institution, Their desperation might itself reveal their identity and intentions. A bold strategy, Peter acknowledged, and one that suggests either considerable courage or considerable naivete, possibly both. But it fails to explain why you wished me to arrive in a cloak of discretion. If you genuinely believed your thief would reveal themselves through desperation, surely the police would suffice. Harrington set down his glass with a trembling hand. Because, Lord Peter, the person I suspect of being involved in this affair is someone within this household, someone I am deeply reluctant to accuse without evidence so overwhelming that even the police cannot dismiss it as the paranoid fancy of an old man. Before Peter could resp, the door opened, and a woman entered. Elegant, perhaps 35, with dark hair arranged in the fashionable waves of the current season. Her expression suggested she had not been expecting to find her husband conducting an interview with a visitor, and still less had she anticipated the level of emotional exposure evident in his countenance. "Harrington," she said, her voice carrying the precise diction of someone raised to never raise their voice, "the servants are asking whether we shall require dinner in the small dining room tonight, or whether your guest will be joining us in the main hall." Peter rose, his courtesy automatic and complete. "Lord Peter Wimsey, madam. I have only just arrived." She regarded him with eyes that were remarkably steady and gave nothing whatsoever away. "Constance Wells," she replied. "How very good of you to come so promptly. I'm sure my husband has been in quite a state about the medallion. Men and their antiquities can be so tedious." Behind her, partially obscured by the doorframe, Peter caught the briefest glimpse of a third figure, younger, perhaps 25, with features that bore a striking resemblance to Sir Harrington's, the natural son, he presumed. But what arrested his attention was not the resemblance, but rather the expression on the young man's face as he observed Lady Wells. It was an expression of such mingled contempt and fascination that Peter wondered whether the household secrets went rather deeper than simple art theft. Peter's instinct for household dynamics, honed by years of navigating the treacherous waters of aristocratic family life, immediately registered the tension that Lady Wells's arrival had introduced. The young man behind her, whom he now perceived to be hovering with the deliberate casualness of someone attempting to appear unobserved, withdrew from the doorway with a smoothness that suggested long practice in the art of strategic retreat. Peter filed away this detail with the same meticulous attention he applied to architectural quirks and railway timetables. "How very considerate of you to think of practicalities, Lady Wells," Peter said, executing a small bow. "Though I confess I have developed something of an aversion to formal dining rooms. They encourage precisely the sort of stiff conversation that murders thrive upon. Perhaps the small room might suffice? Informality often loosens tongues in the most remarkable manner." A faint shadow crossed Lady Wells's face, whether amusement or irritation, Peter could not quite determine. She was, he reflected, the sort of woman who had learned to control her expressions with the precision of a concert pianist controlling her fingering. That in itself was interesting. Most people of genuine innocence wore their emotions with considerably less discipline. "As you prefer," she said, turning to address her husband directly, though her words carried an edge that suggested Peter remained very much the subject of her attention. "Shall I inform Mrs. Pemberton to prepare the small dining room for 8 o'clock? And will your guest be requiring a bedroom, or does he intend to return to the village?" "He shall require a room," Sir Harrington said quickly, perhaps too quickly. "The amber room, I think. It has the best light for reading." "How thoughtful," Lady Wells murmured. "Though I should have thought Lord Peter's reading would be of a more urgent nature, given the circumstances. Still, the amber room overlooks the drive, which may prove useful should he wish to observe comings and goings." She smiled, but it was the sort of smile that contained no warmth whatsoever, merely the mechanical arrangement of facial muscles designed to convey civility. "I shall leave you gentlemen to your consultation. Haringto. Do try not to worry yourself into a state. These matters always resolve themselves far more prosaically than one imagines." She departed with a rustling of fabric, leaving behind her the faint scent of expensive perfume, something with jasmine and an undertone Peter recognized as attar of roses. the sort of fragrance that required considerable investment and suggested a woman accustomed to having her preferences accommodated without question. That, Peter observed once the door had closed, is a woman who knows considerably more than she has disclosed. Whether this knowledge pertains to the theft or to some other matter entirely remains to be determined. But I should very much like to know why she addressed me as though I were a particularly persistent creditor. He turned to face Harrington directly. Tell me about your wife, not the public biography. Anyone with access to Burke's peerage could obtain that. Tell me about the woman who arranges her expressions with the care of a chess master arranging pieces. Harrington rose abruptly and moved to the window, his back to Peter, his shoulders carrying the weight of secrets that had apparently accumulated over considerably longer than the few weeks since Dr. Creed's death. Constance married me 6 years ago, he said finally, his voice carrying the flatness of a man reciting information he has rehearsed but never quite believed. She was beautiful then. She remains beautiful now, though beauty of that particular quality often masks rather than reveals. Before our marriage, she was living with her father in Hampshire. She had no particular accomplishments beyond the standard accomplishments of her class. She painted indifferently, she played the pianoforte. Competently, she spoke French, which she has since had no occasion to use. But, Peter prompted, detecting the unspoken reservation that hung in the air like moss, "Mature before rain, but I have come to suspect," Harrington continued, "that much of what I believed about her prior life was either fabricated or substantially obscured. A year ago, I received a visit from a man, he never provided his name, who made certain allegations regarding my wife's activities before our marriage. He suggested that she had been involved in activities of a financially questionable nature. Not criminal precisely, but certainly not the sort of thing that would be mentioned in polite society. Blackmail? Peter asked, though he suspected the answer was more complex. The visitor certainly seemed to possess information that gave him considerable leverage. He never explicitly demanded money, but the implication was clear enough. I paid him a sum, £500, to cease his visits and to provide me with assurances that he would not discuss the matter with anyone else. He accepted the payment and disappeared. I have not heard from him since." Peter found himself thinking of Dr. Creed with renewed interest. "And you never inquired as to the specific nature of these allegations?" "I did not dare," Harrington admitted. "I was afraid, and I remain afraid, of what I might discover. The marriage was already established. My pride would not allow me to confront her, and my cowardice would not allow me to investigate independently. So I paid the man and attempted to forget the entire affair until the medallion arrived. Yes. And when Dr. Creed died, when I learned that his death had been ruled a suicide, but that he had left no note, no explanation." Harrington trailed off, then turned to face Peter directly. "The young man you glimpsed in the doorway is my son, James. He was raised abroad, as I'm sure Bunter informed you, though he has been living here at the house for the past 3 months. He arrived quite suddenly, claiming that his guardian had died. And that he wished to know his father. It seemed a natural enough request. I welcomed him. But since his arrival, I have noticed that he and Constance have developed a rapport that strikes me as rather more intimate than the relationship between a stepmother and stepson ought to be." Peter felt the pieces beginning to shift and reconfigure, like a kaleidoscope turned in dim light. "And you believe that one of them stole the medallion?" "I believe," Harrington said slowly, "that one or both of them stole the medallion for reasons that have absolutely nothing to do with archaeology or history. The medallion is merely the visible manifestation of something far darker and more personally destructive." He paused, then added with quiet desperation, "I believe that one of them may have murdered Dr. Creed, and that they have stolen the medallion to prevent me from discovering the truth." The weight of Harrington's confession hung between them like fog, thick and suffocating. Peter returned to his chair and lit a fresh cigarette with deliberate slowness, allowing the silence to settle and the man's nerves to fray just slightly further. In his experience, confession, once begun, required only the gentlest pressure to continue flowing. Harrington had taken the leap. The question now was merely how far down the precipice he would fall before Peter chose to catch him. Murder is rather a substantial leap from financial indiscretion, Peter observed, his tone carrying just enough of his characteristic drawl to suggest he was entertaining rather than fully convinced, though I confess the logical progression has a certain theatrical appeal. Tell me, Harrington, when did you begin to suspect that Dr. Creed's death was anything other than what it appeared to be? Immediately, Harrington replied, though I could not articulate why. The newspaper report suggested that he had been found in his lodgings with an empty bottle of laudanum beside him. The coroner examined the body and found traces of the drug in his system. Everything pointed to a deliberate overdose. Yet there was something wrong about it all. Dr. Creed, during our conversations, had struck me as a man of considerable purpose, driven, even obsessive, but not the sort of man who simply surrenders to despair. Driven men often do surrender to despair, Peter said mildly, frequently with more finality than their less ambitious brethren. But I take your meaning. You sensed something incongruent about the narrative. What specifically troubled you? Harrington retrieved a small leather notebook from his desk, the sort that men of a methodical disposition often keep for recording details they fear might otherwise escape them. He opened it with trembling fingers and consulted a page filled with his careful handwriting. The laudanum bottle, he said. According to the police report I was permitted to examine, the bottle contained sufficient drug to account for the dose found in Dr. Creed's body, with a small quantity remaining. The implication was clear. He had taken a portion and died. But I made inquiries. Laudanum, when taken orally in lethal quantities, typically produces a rather distinctive sweet smell. The room, according to the officer who discovered the body, smelled only of stale air and tobacco. Furthermore, if one consumes enough laudanum to cause death, the process is not instantaneous. It typically requires 2 to 4 hours, during which the victim would have experienced increasing drowsiness, confusion, and difficulty in moving. Yet Dr. Creed was found in his chair, neatly dressed, with his papers organized upon his desk as though he were merely sleeping. Interesting, Peter admitted. You have clearly given this matter considerable thought. And you believe this inconsist. NCY suggests murder rather than suicide. I believe it suggests that someone wished the death to appear as suicide when it was actually something far more deliberate. And I believe that someone visited Dr. Creed's rooms, administered the laudanum through some other means, perhaps injected, perhaps in food or drink, and then arranged the scene to suggest self-administration. Peter stood and began to pace, a habit that Bunter had long since ceased attempting to discourage. An admirable theory, though admittedly speculative. You have, however, overlooked something rather crucial. If the murderer wished to conceal their crime beneath the guise of suicide, they would hardly have chosen laudanum as the weapon. The inconsistencies you mention would be apparent to anyone with even elementary knowledge of toxicology. A far simpler method would have been to arrange an accident, a fall from a window perhaps, or a fire. The killer, if they existed, was either extraordinarily incompetent or was not, in fact, attempting to conceal the murder at all. Harrington's face paled slightly. I do not follow you. I suspect you do, but you have not yet admitted it to yourself. Consider, if the murder were meant to appear convincingly as suicide, it would have been accomplished with considerably more care. The fact that the appearance is so transparent, so easily pierced by the sort of questions an intelligent man might ask, suggests that the murderer was not concerned with maintaining the illusion indefinitely. They merely required sufficient time for the death to be officially closed before serious investigation could commence. 3 weeks, perhaps? Enough time for witnesses' memories to grow hazy and for attention to turn to fresher scandals. Peter paused at the window, looking out toward the drive where Lady Wells had suggested observation might prove fruitful. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the gravel. Furthermore, if the theft of the medallion is connected to Dr. Creed's death, as you believe, then we must consider whether the medallion was stolen to conceal evidence or to recover evidence. There is a substantial difference between the two scenarios. I confess I had not considered that distinction, Harrington admitted. Then consider it now. If your wife or your son murdered Dr. Creed to prevent him from revealing something the medallion could prove, they would have stolen it to remove that proof. But if they stole the medallion for other reasons entirely, if Dr. Creed's death and the theft are merely coincidental, then we are pursuing entirely the wrong thread. The question is not whether they murdered him, but whether his death and the theft are even connected at all. A sound at the door interrupted further discussion. Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, appeared, a woman of perhaps 60, with the sort of face that suggested long familiarity with household secrets and the discretion not to voice them. "Begging your pardon, sir," she addressed Harrington, "but Mrs. Wells has asked whether Lord Peter might join the family for tea in the drawing-room. She thought it might be more pleasant than waiting until dinner, what with the light being so good this time of day." Peter exchanged a glance with Harrington. "How very considerate of Lady Wells," he said smoothly. "Do assure her that I should be delighted. Tell me, Mrs. Pemberton, how long have you been in the household's employ?" The housekeeper's expression did not alter, though something in her eyes suggested increased wariness. "Nigh on 30 years, my lord. I came to work for Sir Harrington when he was but a young man building his first mill." "Then you were not here when Mr. James arrived 3 months ago?" "I was, my lord. I've been here the whole time, as I said. And in those 3 months, have you observed anything unusual in his conduct or his relationship with the household members?" "Servants often notice things that escape the attention of those in more elevated positions." Mrs. Pemberton's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I notice nothing that would be proper for me to discuss, my lord." "How very admirable," Peter murmured, "though I wonder whether propriety extends to remaining silent about matters that might constitute crimes. Still, we shall not press you now. Lead on to the drawing-room, if you would be so kind." As they followed the housekeeper through the corridors of the Harrington estate, Peter reflected that the household was indeed revealing itself as precisely what he had suspected, a mansion constructed not merely of brick and mortar, but of carefully maintained lies, jealousies, and secrets so deeply buried that their excavation might well destroy everyone involved in their concealment. The drawing-room of the Harrington estate exemplified that particularly English aesthetic of comfort that masked profound discomfort beneath layers of chintz and good taste. Afternoon light streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny accusations in the air. Lady Wells sat positioned with calculated grace upon a Chippendale sofa, a teacup balanced with such precision on her lap that Peter wondered whether she had trained herself to maintain perfect stillness through sheer force of will. Beside her, occupying a chair that seemed to keep him at a deliberate distance from his stepmother, was James Harrington, younger than Peter had initially assessed, perhaps 23, with his father's colouring, but his mother's, Peter presumed, finer features and an expression that suggested he was perpetually engaged in some internal calculation. "Lord Peter," Lady Wells greeted him with that same mechanical smile she had deployed earlier. "How delightful that you have consented to join us. James, do offer Lord Peter the sandwiches. Mrs. Pemberton has outdone herself. The cucumber was particularly fresh from the garden this morning." There was something in the way she pronounced his name, James, that contained a weight Peter found entirely fascinating. It was neither affectionate nor dismissive, but rather occupied some careful middle ground that suggested years of practice in the art of maintaining precisely calibrated emotional distance. "You are most kind, Peter," said, accepting a cup of tea from James with a nod of acknowledgement. The young man's hand was steady, but his eyes betrayed a wariness that suggested he was acutely aware of Peter's professional scrutiny. "I confess I have been examining the theft of the medallion with considerable interest. Your stepmother informs me that such matters resolve themselves with surprising prosaic regularity. Do you share her optimism, Mr. Harrington?" James glanced toward Lady Wells before responding, a gesture that did not escape Peter's attention. "I confess I know very little about the medallion," he said carefully. "Father only recently acquired it. I had not even examined it closely before it was stolen." "How unfortunate," Peter observed, sipping his tea with apparent contentment, though he found it several degrees cooler than was optimal. One would think that a newly arrived member of the household might have taken considerable interest in a piece so recently acquired and so prominently displayed. The museum, I understand, had only just opened its new exhibition featuring the medallion when the theft occurred. James has only recently begun to interest himself in Father's collecting, Lady Wells interjected smoothly. Before his arrival, he was occupied with matters abroad. The habits of a country gentleman are not something that descend naturally to all men. Some require cultivation. The implication was subtle but unmistakable. James was an outsider, not yet properly integrated into the rhythms and expectations of the household. Whether this was meant as explanation or indictment, Peter could not quite determine. Curious, Peter mused, setting down his teacup with deliberate care. I have been considering the chronology of the theft, and I find myself troubled by a particular detail that the police appear to have overlooked entirely. The medallion was, you say, displayed in the museum's exhibition. The museum closes at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and the theft was discovered when the curator arrived at 8 o'clock this morning. That provides a 13-hour window for the theft to have occurred. Yet the police seem quite confident that it occurred specifically during the night hours between closing and opening. Why should they have drawn this conclusion without forensic evidence suggesting a particular time? James shifted slightly in his chair, his fingers tightening almost imperceptibly around his own teacup. I imagine the police made reasonable assumptions based on the fact that the museum was locked and empty overnight. Precisely, Peter agreed. Reasonable assumptions. Yet reasonableness and accuracy are not always congruent bedfellows. I am told that the museum's curator, a Mr. Edmund Pritchard, is a man of methodical habits. He opens the museum each morning and walks through the exhibition rooms before beginning his administrative work. Is that correct? I believe so, Lady Wells said, her expression remaining perfectly composed. Though I confess I know very little about Mr. Pritchard's personal habits, yet you know the museum quite well, Peter suggested gently. I understand you and Sir Harrington attended the exhibition opening last week? We did. It was a dreadfully dull affair, full of the sort of local dignitaries who believe that attending cultural events absolves them of the necessity of actually appreciating culture. How very astute, Peter said. Did you examine the medallion yourself during that opening? I should think a woman of your evident taste and refinement would have wished to view the object. Her husband had so generously donated. Lady Wells's smile did not waver, but Peter detected the faintest tightening at the corners of her eyes. The sort of microscopical betrayal that most observers would miss. Entirely. Naturally, I examined it, she replied. It was displayed beneath a glass case, as I recall, with rather inadequate lighting. I confess I could not see it with sufficient clarity to form a worthwhile judgment of its aesthetic qualities. Ah, Peter said, as though a puzzle piece had just slotted into place. Inadequate lighting? How terribly frustrating for you. Yet Sir Harrington mentioned examining the medallion with a magnifying glass in order to perceive the fine inscriptions upon it. I wonder how you managed to avoid noticing those same inscriptions during your viewing, particularly if you were standing close enough to examine the object's general aesthetic qualities. I did not examine it closely, Lady Wells corrected, and for the first time Peter heard a note of genuine irritation beneath her controlled exterior. I merely glanced at it as one does at any exhibition piece. One hardly stands about peering through museum glass like some sort of medieval scholar. No, indeed, Peter agreed. That would be most unseemly. And yet, if one knew in advance that there were inscriptions of particular significance upon the medallion, if one had, say, been provided with information regarding the object's hidden properties by someone knowledgeable in such matters, one might be rather more inclined to examine it closely despite the inadequate lighting, might one not? The silence that followed was profound enough to make the ticking of the mantelpiece clock audible. James had gone quite pale, and Lady Wells's composure had developed a hairline fracture that suggested it was in danger of shattering entirely. I think, Peter continued, rising with elegant unhaste, that I should very much like to examine the museum's layout this evening, after closing. And I should like to speak with Mr. Pritchard about the precise appearance of the medallion in its case. There are questions regarding glass quality, lighting angles, and the accessibility of the case lock that I suspect may prove rather illuminating. He turned to face them both directly. Moreover, I should like to know the true nature of Dr. Nathaniel Creed's relationship to this household. Because I confess I am growing increasingly persuaded that the medallion and the doctor's death are not merely connected. They are two expressions of the same fundamental crisis of conscience, and I suspect that one of you has chosen to resolve that crisis through methods considerably more permanent than theft. Peter's departure from the drawing-room left a vacuum of tension in its wake, one that neither Lady Wells nor James appeared inclined to fill with conversation. The afternoon light had begun its inexorable shift toward amber and shadow, lending the room the quality of a stage set awaiting the final act. Sir Harrington, who had excused himself discreetly before Peter's final pronouncement, was waiting in the library when Peter emerged into the corridor, his expression suggesting that he had positioned himself to intercept Peter before any further conversations could occur. "You believe one of them murdered Creed?" Harrington said without preamble, his voice reduced to barely more than a whisper despite their isolation. "But which one? And how?" The coroner was quite definitive in his conclusions. "Coroners frequently are," Peter replied, accepting a brandy that Harrington pressed upon him with the urgency of a drowning man grasping at driftwood. "That is precisely their weakness. They arrive at conclusions and then defend them with the fervor of men who have invested their professional reputations in being correct. However, I have not yet concluded that Creed was murdered at all. I have merely suggested that murder and theft may flow from the same source, which is a rather different proposition. What I require is information, the sort that only someone intimate with the household's true dynamics can provide." Harrington sank into a leather wingback chair with the air of a man whose knees had suddenly forgotten their function. "I do not know what you wish me to tell you. I have already disclosed my suspicions regarding Constance and James." "You have disclosed suspicions born of anxiety and wounded pride," Peter said, not unkindly. "But you have not yet disclosed facts. Tell me about James's arrival 3 months ago. You mentioned that his guardian had died and that he wished to know his father. Surely such a reunion warranted inquiries into who this guardian was, where James had been raised, and how one conducts a 15-year-old child across Europe to his paternal home." "He was 23, not 15, Harrington corrected weakly. "Not a child at all. Even more intriguing," Peter observed. "A grown man arriving with a story of guardianship and death. Did you verify any of this? Did you write to solicitors, make inquiries regarding the supposed death?" Harrington's silence provided answer enough. "I see. You did not. You accepted the narrative because it was convenient for you to do so. It allowed you to indulge a paternal impulse you had apparently suppressed for over 2 decades, and it required no uncomfortable investigations into your own past conduct. But the question remains, how did James discover you? Who told him he had a father in Ashford-in-the-Water? He said his guardian had informed him before his death, a man named Carstairs, who had raised him in Brussels and later in Vienna. And did this convenient Carstairs leave any documentation, letters perhaps, proof of guardianship?" "I do not recall," Harrington admitted. "I did not press the matter. I was simply pleased to have a son." Peter set down his brandy wit. "Deliberate care. Listen to me carefully, Harrington. What you are experiencing is not love for your natural son. It is nostalgia for a version of yourself that never existed, combined with guilt for abandoning your maternal obligations 23 years ago. These are powerful emotions, and they render a man susceptible to manipulation of the most sophisticated kind. I suspect that James Harrington is not your son at all, but rather a carefully constructed fiction designed to gain access to this household for purposes that remain as yet unclear." Harrington's face flushed with indignation. "That is preposterous. The resemblance to you is negligible," Peter interrupted gently. "I observed him for no more than 5 minutes and noted that his bone structure suggests a different paternal heritage entirely. But more importantly, a man who has been raised abroad without knowledge of English social conventions would exhibit certain characteristics that James conspicuously lacks. He moves through this house with the ease of someone intimately familiar with its geography, its rhythms, its secrets. That suggests prior knowledge or careful preparation." Peter rose and moved to the window, watching the shadows lengthen across the grounds. "Now tell me about Dr. Creed. How did he come to know you? What was the true nature of his visit?" Harrington hesitated, and in that hesitation, Peter perceived the presence of information deliberately withheld. He came with a letter of introduction from a mutual acquaintance, a gentleman I had known years ago, before my marriage. "A gentleman," Peter repeated softly. "Not a lady, then. A gentleman from your youth, someone whose acquaintance you preferred not to advertise after you became respectable and wealthy." "You presume too much," Harrington said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I presume exactly intrigue." Peter replied, "The letter, do you still possess it?" "It was destroyed. I burned it. How very inconvenient for us both." "But you remember its contents?" Harrington rose abruptly and moved to his desk, unlocking a drawer with shaking hands. From within, he withdrew a slim wooden box, the sort used for storing important documents, and extracted a single piece of paper that had been carefully folded. Not a letter, Peter noted with interest, but rather a newspaper clipping, aged and yellowed, dated from approximately 18 years previous. "Read it," Harrington said, extending the clipping toward Peter. "And then you will understand why I could not speak of this matter with the police, and why the medallion represents something far more dangerous than anyone yet imagines." Peter took the clipping and adjusted the light. The headline read, "Scandal at Tea Diplomatic Reception. Flemish nobleman's daughter vanishes with valuable artifacts." Beneath, in smaller type, the daughter of the late Count de Valen, identified as Miss Elena de Valen, age 24, has disappeared following a reception at the British Embassy in Brussels. She is believed to have fled the country with several items of significant historical and sentimental value, including a 15th-century medallion bearing family insignia. The Count's representatives have declined to pursue legal action, suggesting the matter is of a delicate personal nature. Miss de Valen is described as having dark hair of medium height and answers to the name Elena. Peter looked up from the clipping, his expression revealing nothing. "And Lady Wells?" "Lady Wells," Harrington said quietly, "was born Constance Gribble. But before that, she was Elena de Valen. And the medallion that was donated to the museum 3 weeks ago is not a museum piece at all. It is the very medallion she stole 18 years ago, the medal. Ion that her own family hired Dr. Creed to recover." The newspaper clipping trembled slightly in Peter's hands, not from any physical infirmity, but from the sheer weight of revelation it carried. The pieces, which had until this moment orbited one another in their separate trajectories, suddenly aligned with the precision of a celestial mechanism, and the image they formed was considerably more complex than simple theft or even murder. It was a portrait of deception spanning nearly 2 decades, maintained through the careful construction of false identities, strategic marriages, and the systematic elimination of anyone who threatened to expose the underlying architecture. 18 years, Peter said, lowering the clipping with deliberate slowness. "She has maintained this masquerade for 18 years. And you have known since the day Dr. Creed arrived on your doorstep with his letter of introduction, and yet you said nothing." "I did not know at first," Harrington protested, though the protest carried little conviction. "When Constance and I met, she was Constance Gribble. The resemblance to Elena was sufficient that I might have recognized her, had I been paying attention, but I was not. I was a widower, reasonably wealthy, and she was beautiful and available. The marriage seemed advantageous to both parties. It was only when Creed arrived, when he began to speak obliquely about recovering certain items of sentimental value and made references to Brussels and diplomatic incidents, that I began to suspect the truth." "And you asked her about it," Peter suggested. "I did. She denied everything initially. But when I pressed her, she told me a version of the story, one that cast her as the victim rather than the perpetrator. She claimed that she had been the unwilling accomplice to her brother's theft, that the medallion had been stolen by her sibling as RT of some financial scheme, and that she had been blamed for the crime to protect him. She said she had assumed a new identity to escape the scandal and to begin a new life. She begged me not to reveal her past." "How very touching," Peter observed, his voice carrying an edge that suggested his sympathy was precisely calibrated. to the degree warranted by the narrative. And you believed her? I wanted to believe her, Harrington admitted. Is that not the same thing in the end? I was already married to her. The alternative was scandal and ruin for both of us. The alternative was honesty and the possibility of redemption, Peter corrected. But you chose to protect her instead, which suggests either a degree of affection or a measure of complicity that you have not yet disclosed. Tell me what happened when Dr. Creed began his inquiries. Did he demand restitution of the medallion? Not immediately. He suggested that he had been hired by a family interested in recovering the artifact for personal reasons rather than legal ones. He implied that a substantial payment might resolve the matter discreetly. Constance was terrified. She said that if her family discovered her location, they would have her arrested, or worse. So I paid him. £500, as I mentioned to you earlier, which was precisely the amount required to make his death appear credible as suicide, Peter said softly. A man who has received payment for blackmail and then dies suddenly appears to have committed suicide out of conscience. How very convenient. But tell me, Harrington, did you pay him or did Constance? The question hung in the air between them, and Harrington's silence provided the answer more eloquently than any words could have managed. She paid him, Peter continued. She paid him, and then she visited him in his rooms. Either before or after the payment we shall determine which, and she murdered him. But she did not do so with laudanum, despite what the coroner concluded. She used something else entirely, something that mimicked the symptoms of overdose sufficiently well to satisfy an examination conducted without rigorous toxicological analysis. You cannot know that, Harrington protested. You are speculating. I am deducing, Peter corrected, and my deductions are predicated upon a single crucial observation. If Constance had simply killed Creed and arranged his body to suggest suicide by laudanum, she would have left herself vulnerable to the sort of analysis that any competent investigator might conduct. But she did not do so. Instead, she created a scenario so transparent, so obviously flawed, that it practically demanded further investigation. And she did this deliberately, because she required that investigation to reach a specific conclusion. That Creed was indeed the blackmailer, that his death appeared to be suicide, and that the matter could therefore be considered closed by authorities too harried and bureaucratic to examine the inconsistencies. Peter set down the newspaper clipping on the desk with great care. What she did not anticipate was that her husband would hire an investigator with sufficient acuity to perceive that transparency itself could be a form of deception. She believed you would hire the police, that the police would close the matter, and that the medallion would remain safely hidden in the museum, where its significance would be attributed to archaeological rather than criminal provenance. But why steal it at all? Harrington demanded. If she was attempting to hide it, why display it in the museum and then steal it back? Because, Peter said, displaying it in the museum served a very specific purpose. It allowed her to establish that the medallion in the museum was indeed the artifact that had been stolen from Belgium 18 years ago. Once that provenance was established and witnessed by local dignitaries and museum officials, the theft became merely a matter of insurance claims and police paperwork. The medallion could be recovered, or a sufficiently convincing replica could be recovered, and Constance would have accomplished her true objective, the permanent destruction of any evidence linking Elena de Valen to Constance Gribble-Wells. What evidence? Harrington asked, though Peter suspected he had already begun to understand. The inscriptions on the medallion itself. The very inscriptions that you examined with such difficulty using a magnifying glass. Those inscriptions do not merely indicate diplomatic significance, they contain a detailed record of transactions, of names, of dates. They constitute proof of a conspiracy that extends far beyond a single theft. And Dr. Creed, working for the de Valen family, had come to this household not merely to recover the medallion, but to examine those inscriptions and gather whatever additional evidence your wife might have retained. Peter moved toward the door with the fluid grace that preceded his most significant pronouncements. Which means that James Harrington, if he exists at all outside of Constance's elaborate fiction, is almost certainly not your son. He is almost certainly Dr. Creed's associate, sent to this house after the doctor's death to complete the investigation that Creed began. And he has been gathering evidence of his own, evidence that will soon constitute the foundation of a very serious accusation indeed. "What shall I do?" Harrington asked, his voice barely audible. "You shall do nothing," Peter replied. "You shall retire to your room and remain there until I send for you. Because tonight, when darkness falls and everyone believes the household to be asleep, I intend to stage a very theatrical confrontation indeed, one that will force certain truths into the light regardless of how carefully they have been concealed. The hours between dusk and midnight possess a quality entirely their own, a liminal space where day's certainties dissolve into night's ambiguities, and the ordinary becomes susceptible to transformation." Peter had spent the intervening time in a manner calculated to inspire maximum anxiety in those with guilty consciences. He had examined the museum's floor plan with meticulous attention, interviewed Mr. Edmund Pritchard regarding the precise configuration of the medallion's display case, and conducted a thorough inspection of the Harrington household's layout, paying particular attention to the servants' corridors, the locked rooms, and the curious acoustic properties of certain walls that seemed designed for the transmission of sound rather than its suppression. By 11 o'clock, he had positioned himself in the library with a volume of Dante's Inferno, chosen more for its thematic resonance than for any genuine desire to read, and a glass of exceptional brandy that he had discovered in Harrington's private reserve. The household had settled into that peculiar quiet of evening that preceded sleep, though Peter doubted whether anyone within these walls would sleep this night. At precisely 11:30, he heard the sound he had been anticipating, the soft creak of a floorboard in the corridor above, followed by the deliberate, careful footstep of someone attempting to move without being heard. Peter rose and extinguished the library lamps, save for a single reading light positioned to cast shadows rather than illumination. He then made his way to the study adjoining the library. A room he had earlier observed contained a connecting door that communicated with the main corridor. From this vantage point, he could observe without being readily observed, a tactical advantage that had served him well in matters considerably more consequential than this household intrigue. The footsteps descended the main staircase with the deliberation of someone who knew the house well enough to navigate it in darkness. A figure emerged into the hall, too tall to be Lady Wells, too assured in bearing to be the servants. James, then, and moving with the purposefulness of a man engaged in a specific and time-sensitive mission. He carried a small leather satchel, the sort used for documents rather than valuables, and his expression bore the grim determination of someone approaching a culmination rather than a beginning. Peter allowed him to move past the study door, then followed at a discreet distance. James's destination proved to be the drawing room, the very room where Peter had conducted his interrogation hours earlier. The young man did not light a lamp, but rather drew the curtains with careful precision and retrieved a small electric torch from his pocket, the sort that had only recently become available to private consumers. By its narrow beam, he began to examine the room with the systematic attention of a professional searcher. He moved from object to object with practiced efficiency, the mantelpiece, the bookcases, the writing desk. Each location received examination, though Peter noted that James seemed to be searching for something small. Documents, perhaps, or a key. The search continued for nearly 20 minutes, during which Peter remained motionless in the doorway, content to observe the methodology of this supposed intruder. It was the sound of another footstep that precipitated the crisis. Not from the corridor, but from the adjacent room. Lady Wells appeared in the doorway connecting the drawing room to her private sitting chamber, her expression transforming from drowsy confusion to something far more calculating upon perceiving James with his torch and his methodical search. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice pitched low but carrying an edge that suggested barely restrained violence. James spun, his torch beam wavering across her face. "The medallion," he said, his accent shifting subtly, becoming less carefully cultivated and more genuinely continental. "I need to know what you did with the medallion." "The medallion is safely stored," Lady Wells replied, moving into the room with the predatory grace of a woman who suddenly found herself in familiar territory. as are all of my insurance policies. Did you truly believe I would leave evidence of my past in a museum display case? Did you think I was such a fool as to risk everything on Dr. Creed's promises of discretion? Dr. Creed is dead, James said. And now Peter detected something in his voice that suggested the young man's composure was beginning to fracture. He was murdered, and you killed him. You poisoned him and arranged his body to suggest suicide. I did nothing of the sort, Lady Wells said, and there was an odd quality to her denial, not the defensive denial of someone accused of a crime, but rather the corrective denial of someone annoyed at imprecision. Dr. Creed was murdered by someone else entirely, someone whose interests aligned with my own only by coincidence. As for the poison you mention, the police found laudanum in his system, not poison. Do try to keep your accusations coherent. It was at this moment that Peter chose to reveal himself, stepping into the drawing room proper and closing the door behind him with deliberate care. The electric torch beam swung toward him, and he held up a hand to shield his eyes. "If I might impose upon this tender reunion," he said pleasantly, "I should like to clarify several matters before anyone makes accusations they cannot subsequently retract. Mr. Valen, or should I address you as Lady Wells, you claim that Dr. Creed was murdered by someone whose interests aligned with your own. I should very much like to know who that someone is, and whether they are currently residing within this household or merely visiting." Lady Wells's composure cracked, revealing for the briefest instant the raw fear beneath. "You cannot possibly—" "But I can," Peter interrupted gently, "and I have. The question is not who murdered Dr. Creed, Mr. Valen. The question is why. And I suspect that the answer to that question will require us to reconsider everything we have assumed about James's presence in this household, about Harrington's naivete, and about the true identity of the man who stands to inherit this estate should anything unfold. Whodunit occur to your husband." The silence that followed was profound and absolute, interrupted only by the distant ticking of the hall clock and the faint sound of a door opening somewhere in the upper reaches of the house. Peter's expression remained pleasantly enigmatic, but his eyes tracked the ceiling with the precision of a man who had suddenly perceived the presence of a third actor in this elaborate drama, one whose role had been carefully concealed until the moment when their intervention could no longer be avoided. The footsteps from above grew nearer, descending the main staircase with a heaviness that suggested their owner had abandoned all pretense of stealth. Sir Harrington appeared in the doorway, dressed in his nightclothes, and bearing an expression of such profound anguish that Peter felt a momentary twinge of something approaching sympathy. Behind him, however, came a figure that transformed the emotional landscape of the room entirely. He was perhaps 40, distinguished in appearance, with the bearing of a man accustomed to command and the coldness of one who had learned to regard human suffering as merely a variable in a larger equation. His resemblance to Lady Wells was sufficiently marked that even without introduction Peter understood the nature of the relationship. Here stood the brother, the alleged perpetrator of the original theft, the architect of whatever conspiracy had culminated in Dr. Creed's death. Enough theatrical games, the man said, his accent distinctly continental and his English carrying the precision of someone who had studied rather than absorbed the language. "I am Count Christophe de Valen, and I have come to reclaim what is rightfully mine, the medallion, the documents, and my sister's freedom from this contemptible charade." Peter inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the introduction with the courtesy one might have. "Ode to a particularly dangerous specimen in a naturalist's collection." "How very dramatic," he observed. "Though I confess I am troubled by the timeline. If you have only just arrived, Count de Valen, then you could not possibly have murdered Dr. Creed, whose death occurred 3 weeks ago, which means either your sister murdered him, an accusation she has just categorically denied, or someone else within this household took it upon themselves to dispose of the good doctor. And as I examine the faces before me, I find myself wondering whether the guilty party stands among us at all, or whether they are, in fact, conspicuously absent." Harrington's face had gone ashen. "You cannot mean—" "I mean precisely what I say," Peter continued, his eyes fixed upon the Count with an intensity that suggested he was perceiving something invisible to ordinary observation. "Consider the facts. Dr. Creed arrived at this house 3 weeks ago with a letter of introduction. He made inquiries about the medallion and made certain financial demands. He was subsequently found dead in his London lodgings, poisoned in a manner that was disguised as laudanum overdose. The poisoning was performed with such deliberate clumsiness that any competent investigator would immediately perceive the inconsistencies. The coroner, however, was less competent than average, and the case was closed. All of this suggests that the murderer was not concerned with concealing the crime indefinitely, but rather with gaining a specific quantity of time enough for certain arrangements to be made, certain documents to be secured. Peter moved toward the fireplace, his posture suggesting relaxation, though his attention remained entirely focused. The medallion, meanwhile, was donated to the museum and subsequently stolen. Yet the theft could have been accomplished far more easily if the object had remained in this household. Instead, it was displayed publicly, its provenance established, its significance as a historical artifact confirmed. And then it was stolen, not by Lady Wells, who would have possessed no motive for such theatrical gestures, but by someone who required the theft to occur in a specific manner, witnessed by specific individuals at a specific time. "This is nonsense," the Count said, though his voice had acquired a tremor that suggested Peter's deductions were striking closer to uncomfortable truths than he had anticipated. "Is it?" Peter asked mildly. "Then perhaps you can explain why Sir Harrington's natural son, the young man who arrived 3 months ago claiming to be raised abroad by a guardian named Carstairs, bears a striking resemblance not to Sir Harrington at all, but rather to yourself, and why his professional competence in matters of investigation suggests training rather than intuition." James, or whatever his true name might be, had gone perfectly still, the electric torch hanging forgotten at his side. Lady Wells had moved closer to her brother, their body language now suggesting alliance rather than the emotional distance they had previously maintained. "I suspect," Peter continued, warming to his theme with the enthusiasm of a man approaching the resolution of a particularly satisfying puzzle, "that you orchestrated this entire affair, Count de Valen. You learned that Dr. Creed had been hired to locate and investigate the medallion. You realized that his inquiries might lead to the discovery of evidence sufficient to destroy your sister's marriage and expose her past. So you arranged for his murder, not through your own hand, but through the agency of someone already present in this household, someone whose identity was sufficiently obscure and whose motive was sufficiently complex that investigators would look in entirely the wrong direction." Peter's gaze shifted to Harrington, and in that gaze lay something approaching genuine pity. "The question that remains is whether your devoted wife murdered Dr. Creed, or whether you did so yourself, either out of misguided protectiveness or out of a desire to protect whatever arrangement you had made with your wife's family, in exchange for her hand and her cooperation in concealing her past." "I did not kill anyone," Harrington said, his voice barely audible. "No," Peter agreed. "I do not believe you did. Which leaves only one possibility that fits the evidence with sufficient precision. Mrs. Pemberton murdered Dr. Creed." The revelation hung in the air like a physical force. Lady Wells's expression shifted from defiance to something approaching contempt, while the Count's face darkened with an emotion that Peter recognized as frustrated fury at having his carefully constructed plan exposed. "Mrs. Pemberton," Peter continued, addressing the empty doorway as though the housekeeper stood before him, "who has served this household for 30 years, who was present when Harrington married the woman he knew was Elena de Valen, who was party to every secret whispered within these walls. She murdered Dr. Creed not out of loyalty to her employer, but out of loyalty to the woman who had, over the course of decades, become something far more significant than a mere mistress, a daughter figure, a confidant, perhaps even the repository of affections that life had otherwise denied her." Peter turned back to the assembled conspirators. "I suspect you shall all have considerable explaining to do to Scotland Yard, but first, I believe it would be advisable to discuss the precise nature of the conspiracy that brought you all together, and whether murder, in the final accounting, was truly the most expedient solution to your rather complicated family difficulties." The drawing room had acquired the peculiar quality of a courtroom in miniature, with Peter occupying the position of judge, jury, and prosecuting counsel with an ease that suggested he had performed this role sufficiently often that it had become second nature. Yet before he could elaborate further upon his deductions, the door opened and Mrs. Pemberton herself appeared, no longer attempting to maintain the demeanor of a servant, but rather stepping into the room with the bearing of someone who had finally relinquished the burden of pretense. She was older than Peter had initially assessed, perhaps 70 rather than 60, with the kind of face that had been worn smooth by decades of emotional suppression. Yet her eyes held something that no mere servant's eyes should contain, a fierce, protective love that transcended the ordinary bonds of employment, and suggested a depth of connection that rendered Peter's hypothesis regarding her motive suddenly entirely plausible. "I did kill him," Mrs. Pemberton said, her voice carrying neither defiance nor remorse, but rather the flat certainty of someone stating an objective fact. "Dr. Creed came to this house intending to destroy Miss Elena, Lady Wells if you prefer the fiction. He came with his letters of introduction and his academic courtesies, but his purpose was extortion and blackmail. He would have taken the medallion, and when that proved insufficient leverage, he would have exposed her entire history, ruined her marriage, and left her with nothing but shame and social destruction." "Why not simply pay him more generously?" Peter inquired, with genuine curiosity. Surely a man motivated purely by financial gain might have been satisfied with a sufficiently substantial sum, because there is no sum sufficient to purchase a man's silence when he perceives that silence has become a liability, Mrs. Pemberton replied. Dr. Creed was not a simple blackmailer. He was an agent of the de Valen family, sent to recover the medallion and gather evidence sufficient to prosecute Miss Elena for theft and fraud. Once he had accomplished that objective, money would have become irrelevant. The family wanted their medallion, but more than that, they wanted revenge for the shame she had brought upon them. Lady Wells made a sound, half gasp, half sob, that suggested this perspective on the family's motivation had not been previously acknowledged, even within the conspiracy itself. The Count's expression grew darker still, as though Mrs. Pemberton had just articulated something he had spent years avoiding. "So you poisoned him," Peter said, not as accusation but as simple statement of fact, but not with laudanum, despite what the coroner concluded. "What did you use, Mrs. Pemberton? Strychnine, perhaps? Arsenic? Something more exotic?" "Belladonna extract," Mrs. Pemberton replied, with the precision of someone reciting a recipe. "Concentrated, administered in his tea when he visited Dr. Creed's rooms in London under the guise of a cleaning woman. The symptoms mimic laudanum poisoning sufficiently well to deceive a cursory examination. The belladonna causes confusion, drowsiness, and eventually cessation of respiration. He died believing himself to be drifting into sleep." "How very considerate of you," Peter observed. "And the arrangement of his body, the bottle of laudanum placed beside him." "That was not my doing," Mrs. Pemberton said, and for the first time something approaching uncertainty flickered across her features. "When I departed his rooms, he was arranged in his chair precisely as he would appear to be sleeping. Someone else visited him afterward and arranged the false evidence." The implications cascaded through the room like dominoes in collapse. Peter's eyes shifted to the Count, then to Lady Wells, Hen finally to James, or whatever his true name might be. "Ah," Peter said softly, "then we have not one murder, but two separate acts of intervention. Mrs. Pemberton poisoned Dr. Creed out of protective devotion. But someone else, someone with a rather different motive, subsequently arranged the scene to suggest suicide. Someone who required that the death appear accidental, or at minimum, sufficiently ambiguous that it would not invite investigation." "My brother," Lady Wells said, her voice carrying the weight of revelation. "Christoph arranged the false evidence. He arrived in England the day after Dr. Creed's death. He came to ensure that the medallion remained hidden and that the family's involvement in the affair could never be traced." The Count's composure finally shattered entirely. "You cannot prove this," he snarled at Peter. "You have only the accusations of a woman who has already confessed to murder and the speculation of a detective who was not present at any of these events. Scotland Yard will examine the evidence and find nothing that conclusively implicates me." "You are quite right," Peter acknowledged, with a smile that suggested he found the Count's confidence rather amusing. They will find nothing conclusive. However, they will find sufficient circumstantial evidence to warrant arrest, interrogation, and quite possibly extradition proceedings to Belgium, where the original theft has never been officially closed. Moreover, they will discover that the man who arrived in England 3 months ago posing as your son, Sir Harrington, is in fact your brother's associate, a professional investigator hired to locate and secure the medallion before your sister could dispose of it entirely. Peter moved toward the door with the unhurried grace that preceded his departures from crime scenes. "What fascinates me most about this affair," he continued, addressing the room at large, is the fundamental misjudgment of human nature that has driven every participant to their current predicament. Mrs. Pemberton believed that killing Dr. Creed would protect Miss Elena. The Count believed that arranging false evidence would protect his family's interests. James, or whatever his actual name is, believed that recovering the medallion would restore honor to the de Valen lineage, and Sir Harrington believed that ignorance of his wife's past would preserve his marriage. He paused at the threshold, his hand upon the doorframe. Yet none of you perceived the single most obvious truth, that secrets once created possess a momentum of their own. They do not merely conceal the past, they actively distort the present and predetermine the future. The medallion was never truly the objective of this conspiracy. It was merely the physical manifestation of lies that had metastasized from small, comprehensible falsehoods into something monstrous and all-consuming. "What will you do?" Harrington asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I shall telephone Scotland Yard," Peter replied. "I shall inform them that a murder has occurred in London, that the victim was poisoned by a woman acting from misguided loyalty, and that the subsequent arrangement of false evidence implicates certain parties in a conspiracy to obstruct justice. The legal consequences of these actions will unfold according to the dictates of English law, which is considerably more merciful than the psychological consequences that you have all already begun to experience." He opened the door, then paused once more. "Mrs. Pemberton," he said gently, "you may inform the authorities that your devotion, however misplaced, was at least comprehensible. The rest of you have considerably more difficulty explaining why you constructed such elaborate deceptions when truth, however painful, would have served you considerably better." With that pronouncement, Peter Wimsey departed into the night, leaving behind him a household collapsed into recrimination, despair, and the slow, inexorable recognition that the price of maintaining elaborate lies had proved considerably higher than anyone had initially calculated. The October night had grown colder by the time Peter reached the railway station at Ashford in the water, though whether this was a mere meteorological phenomenon or a reflection of the emotional climate he had recently departed remained open to philosophical speculation. The station master, a man of advancing years and limited imagination, seemed surprised to receive a visitor at such an unseemly hour, though he rallied sufficiently to arrange passage on the milk train that departed for London at 3:30 in the morning. Peter occupied a first-class compartment alone, his cigarette case open beside him, and his mind engaged in the sort of retrospective analysis that frequently followed the conclusion of his more complex cases. The puzzle, viewed in its entirety, possessed a certain tragic elegance, the sort of elegance that resided in the inevitable collision between human hope and human limitation. Each of the principals had acted according to their own logic, their own understanding of necessity, and yet the cumulative effect of their individual decisions had been to create precisely the disaster they had most feared. By the time the train pulled into King's Cross at 7:30, Peter had constructed a comprehensive narrative that would satisfy the authorities' requirement for explanation, while simultaneously serving his own far more exacting standards of intellectual coherence. He dispatched a telegram to Inspector Lestrade, a man of sufficient competence that Peter could generally rely upon him to execute the necessary formalities, without requiring excessive guidance, outlining the essential facts of the case, and suggesting that warrants be issued for the arrest of Count Christophe de Valen, and for the questioning of both Sir Harrington Wells and the individual identifying himself as James Harrington regarding their knowledge of and participation in the conspiracy to conceal evidence of murder. Mrs. Pemberton's confession, Peter knew, would present complications. She was 70 years old, had acted from demonstrably genuine affection, and had poisoned Dr. Creed not out of malice but out of a desperate, misguided protectiveness. The courts would likely treat her with a degree of leniency, though leniency in cases of premeditated murder was necessarily limited. She would spend years in prison, years she did not truly have remaining, as punishment for having loved too fiercely and acted too decisively. It was this consideration that prompted Peter, upon reaching his flat in Piccadilly, to compose a letter not to the authorities but to Sir Harrington himself. He wrote with his characteristic precision, detailing not the facts of the case, which Harrington already possessed in their raw form, but rather the psychological and emotional architecture that had made the tragedy inevitable. He explained, with the kind of clarity that only comes from standing outside a situation rather than within it, how each person's attempt to protect themselves had paradoxically rendered them more vulnerable. He suggested, with all the delicacy that such a sensitive matter warranted, that understanding the origins of human weakness often proved more valuable than condemning its manifestations. He concluded the letter with a classical quotation, as was his habit. "We are each the author of our own sorrows, though we frequently mistake ourselves for mere readers of a text written by fate." He did not sign it with his name, but merely with his initials and the date, leaving Harrington the option of either preserving the letter as the advice of an anonymous sage or destroying it as the intrusion of a stranger into matters, better left unexamined. The subsequent days revealed the machinery of justice grinding forward with its characteristic inefficiency. Inspector Lestrade proved capable enough, organizing the arrest of the Count and the detention of James, a man whose actual name, it transpired, was Marcel Arnaud, a professional investigator hired by the de Valen family's lawyers. The evidence regarding Mrs. Pemberton's poisoning proved sufficient to warrant charges, though public sentiment, whipped into sympathetic frenzy by the newspaper's discovery of the human elements underlying the clinical facts, began to shift in her favor almost immediately. By the time the preliminary hearings commenced, the case had become something of a cause célèbre. The story of an elderly woman who had committed murder out of love, of a woman who had constructed an entire false identity to escape her past, of a family conspiracy that spanned continents and decades. The newspapers, sensing the literary potential of the affair, had begun to construct their own narratives, each one emphasizing different elements according to the prejudices and sensibilities of their respective readerships. Peter, who had learned long ago that the public's appetite for justice was considerably less reliable than its appetite for sentiment, made himself unavailable for interviews and declined all invitations to elaborate upon his methods. Instead, he returned to his books, his music, and the gentle rhythms of a life no longer occupied by the urgent necessity of unraveling human deception. It was Bunter who brought him the newspaper clipping some weeks later, presenting it with the neutral expression that characterized his response to all developments in his employer's cases. The headline read, "Mercy in the Dock, Judge Shows Compassion in Pemberton Murder Trial." The article detailed how Mrs. Pemberton, in her testimony, had conducted herself with such dignity and such unwavering commitment to the truth that even the prosecution had begun to seem like the embodiment of bureaucratic cruelty rather than the pursuit of justice. "The sentence, my lord," Bunter observed, setting down the paper with precise care, "is 7 years imprisonment rather than the customary life sentence for premeditated murder." The judge noted her age, her character, and the extraordinary circumstances that motivated her actions. "How very humane," Peter observed, though whether he was addressing the judge or commenting more broadly upon the nature of human justice remained ambiguous. "And what of the Count? Has he been extradited?" "He is currently in custody awaiting trial in Belgium, my lord, on charges relating to the original theft of the medallion. The medallion itself was recovered from a vault in France, where it had apparently been concealed these 18 years. And Sir Harrington? The baronet has withdrawn from public life, my lord. His solicitors indicate that the marriage will be dissolved on grounds of fraud, and that he has chosen to retire to the country estate in order to pursue a life of contemplative solitude." Peter nodded slowly. as though this outcome constituted the only possible conclusion to a story whose ending had been determined the moment its beginning was established. "How very appropriate," he said finally. "The guilty retire to contemplate their guilt, the innocent learn to live with their lack thereof, and the genuinely devoted receive punishment masquerading as mercy. The machinery of justice grinds on, bunter, crushing whoever falls within its path with democratic indifference to their actual culpability." He lit a cigarette and gazed out the window toward the London skyline. "Ring up my mother if you would be so kind. I find myself in urgent need of conversation with someone considerably less complicated than the human psyche. Perhaps she will have some particularly vexing social entanglement that requires my attention. Anything truly would suffice as distraction from the recognition that we are all, in the final accounting, merely performers in a tragedy whose script was written long before our participation began."